am Dana Brownlee. I am so excited to be here again for another real talk about race. Please let me know where you're joining from. We always love to see who's here and where you're joining from. So go ahead and post that in the comments so I can give you a shout out and so I can be sure that somebody's here, okay? And I'm not talking to myself. So we've got somebody from Brazil. Wonderful, wonderful, right? Out the box. We've got international. Hey, Azzy, so glad that you're here. Everybody else, let us know. Let us know. Keep posting it in the comments. We really do want to see who all is here. And I'm so excited that we've got London, we've got Boston. So excited that there's been so much. Queens. I was born in Queens. I was born in Jamaica Hospital in Queens. So we got tons and tons of people on. Hey, Lee. Hey, Catherine. Hey, Janet. Gosh, Roderick. Thank you for letting me know you can hear me. Thank you so much. Lisa, so glad to see everybody. And I'm so excited about all the conversation, the chat, the messaging back and forth that we've been having. I feel like I already know you guys, already love you guys. I feel like I found my people, okay? I found my community. So I really, really want to thank you for that. Let's keep it going, okay? I know we're all really, really busy. That's why I'm trying to limit this to 45 minutes because I feel like, hey, Wendy's such an awesome supporter and she's starting LinkedIn Live, so I can't wait for those. Check them out. But I really want to use this time well, and I'm hoping that it can be informative. I'm hoping that it can be restorative. And I'm hoping it could be beneficial, just like a great workout. You know, you don't always feel maybe the best or as comfortable after that awesome workout, but you feel good about your investment. You feel good about stretching yourself. And so that's what I'm hoping we can do is have some really, really brave conversations. So without further ado, I want to launch into your questions because you sent so many amazing questions, enough for probably 3 or 4 sessions. But I want to launch in and that's how I want to spend the time. So see what I was doing yesterday, really going through all of the questions. And so in Fuchsia, I started putting some of my comments. Because we've got more than we can accomplish today, and certainly we can use these for future sessions, I want to kind of start in reverse order. A lot of the earlier questions, I feel like I answered a lot of those sporadically, or I sent out links to articles, and we'll get to some of those certainly if we have time. My dog just came in. But I want to start with a few that showed up very recently because I think they're really meaty and we didn't touch on those at all. So right out the box, let me start with Desiree. Desiree, thank you so much for engaging so thoughtfully, Desiree. And I know that you're going to be such a blessing to this community. She has 2 awesome questions that I think are really meaty and so many of us can benefit from. First, how does upbringing impact the workplace relative to anti-racism? You know, I often say that the workplace in many ways is this odd kind of petri dish where we're all kind of thrown together. And if I'm being candid, I think we're kind of pretending in a sense or acting like this is our normal life. But for most of us outside of the workplace, our lives tend to be much more homogenous. I mean, we have a tendency to live and play around people who look like us, who have similar backgrounds, similar cultures, who kind of reaffirm our values. So that's one of the reasons why we need to talk about this, because then when we get to the workplace, it can be a little awkward or there can be some conflict. We don't all have the same background. We don't all have the same upbringing, and that absolutely has a great impact. So I'd like you to think about that. And as you guys are thinking about that, I want to be sure everybody can hear me because somebody asked if the video started. Can you guys hear me and you guys see the video? So let me know. Tanya, wonderful. I'm in Atlanta as well. Hey, Abigail. So somebody said they had to refresh the video link. So yeah, let me know if you can see me, if you can hear me. We don't want to lose anybody. So let me know in the comments. Hey, Robert. Hey, Janine. Hey, Hannah, thank you for that tip about refreshing the video link if you're having any problems seeing it. If you end up with major problems, you can I'm always streaming live on YouTube at the same time. So So yes, I'm hearing some people saying yes. Hey, Allison, thank you so much. Allison's my awesome content manager at LinkedIn Learning. So it looks like things are good. So I'm just going to keep going. So I want you to think about that question. How did your upbringing impact the workplace as it relates to race and racism for you? Several people are saying they had to refresh, so you might want to refresh. Think about that. As you're thinking about that, I want to go to, because I want to see some of those answers in the comments. As you're thinking about that, I want to go to her second question, which I thought was awesome as well. What are some tools for anti-racism advocates and thought leaders and people really trying to do some of this work, whether professionally or just for your own benefit? So let me start with that. There are obviously tons of resources out there. I don't want to spend too much time because we got the Googler, and so you could certainly Google a lot of great stuff. But one thing I want to recommend, I wrote an article about this on my Forbes page. And if you're not following me on Forbes, consider doing that, because that's really where I post almost all my original content. So follow me on LinkedIn and Forbes. That's pretty much where you're going to get everything. But I wrote an article about the Netflix series 14th Amendment. If you have not seen the Netflix series 14th Amendment, please watch it. It's such an amazing investment. It's education and entertainment at the highest level. It is hosted by Will Smith, I believe also executive produced by Will Smith and Larry Wilmore, I believe. Apologize if I got that incorrect. But just amazing, amazing multicultural cast. White people, Black people, brown people, everyone is in there. But they go through and they tell the story of the 14th Amendment in just the most amazing way. There are, I believe, 6 sessions. I believe the first 3 are specifically focused on the history of African Americans, the history of Black people in this country. And then they talk about women, they talk about LGBTQ, the LGBTQ community, and they also talk about immigrants. But it's just an amazing way. If you're like me and sometimes feel you get a little lazy in terms of the reading, or you're swamped with work and you just kind of need to relax and grab some Doritos and want to have some downtime, watch 14th Amendment. Leslie, thank you for agreeing with that. On Netflix, it's the top. I mean, it's just the best. It's the best that I've seen in that format. And they really create a new format. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that before, but big shout out to Netflix for that. It's amazing. Another organization I want to shout out, if you're not familiar, but the Equal Justice Institute. That's the organization that Brian Stevenson started. Most of you will know Brian Stevenson from Just Mercy, the movie and the book, but his institute is just amazing. They've got so much content out there. If you have an opportunity to visit, it's amazing. But even if you can't do that, you can sign up for their calendar, their daily calendar, and they will email you 1 article a day to learn about the history of injustice in this country. And if you feel like that's too much, just follow me, because I repost it every single day. Okay, so I will shout them out. Also, the last one I'm going to mention specifically is the Racial Equity Institute. They're based out of North Carolina. Let me know if you've attended any of their sessions. They have a phase 1, a phase 2, and other products, other workshops, but they're very intense. So I did the phase 1 and the phase 2 over the pandemic. So it was all virtual, but it's really intense. It's, might be like an entire weekend, but it's very fact-based, tons of information. It's kind of almost where everybody just needs to start. I feel like if everyone took that Racial Equity Institute training in this country, we would be just leaps and bounds ahead of where we are, because for most of us, our level of racial literacy is so dreadfully low. And I would have included myself in that, maybe even as short as 2 years ago or so. And so just having that information just makes all the difference. So I will shout out those 3. Melissa saying she's attended and it's amazing. She's saying it's incredible. So definitely wonderful. And it's not expensive. I mean, they're an organization that clearly is focused on giving back. They're clearly focused on getting the information out there. And maybe for your organization, you're looking to bring someone in. They've got dozens of trainers. So wonderful organization for you to familiarize yourself with. In the comments, let us know what other recommendations you guys have. I'm sure there are tons of things out there. I didn't start rattling off names of books because, then we'll be here until next November or something. But books, videos, and I think this is important. We all have limited time. I've got 2 small kids, I've got a business, I've got a lot going on. I don't have time to read 8 hours a day. Okay. So it's not practical. Think about what works best with your personality, with your learning style, and with your lifestyle. So for me, I listen to Audible while I'm jogging. I listen to Audible while I'm grocery shopping. So that kind of is what works for me. And it doesn't take up additional time. But I learned so much. Maybe you're a video person. Maybe you're not so much a book person. Start watching Ta-Nehisi Coates' videos online. He's one thought leader who I feel has a lot of great video content. Robin DiAngelo has some great video content out there. So podcasts, or tons of podcasts, things like this. This is why we're glad you're here. It's a 45-minute commitment, but hopefully it's going to be chock full of great information. And Wendy's also throwing out that the 13th Amendment was also amazing. I believe that is also on Netflix. I actually think I looked for that one time and couldn't find that. So wonderful to hear those recommendations. So keep those coming. But now let's change gears a little bit and just talk about that first question. How did your upbringing impact the workplace? Meaning how you show up in the workplace, your attitudes in the workplace, but how did it impact the workplace from an anti-racism or an inclusion perspective? So I'd love for you to share some of those comments. And as you're sharing them, and I'll read some of them, obviously, let me just share with you. When I first read that, I thought about it. I'm sure it impacted me in lots of different ways. But one of the most stark ways I think that my upbringing, and maybe it's not so much my upbringing, but just my being Black, impacted me was in terms of my options. And oftentimes, one of the myths I think that's out there is if you are doing well financially, or, it's kind of this class versus race argument, saying, it's not race, it's really a class thing. I feel like I grew up pretty middle class. My parents were both were both PhDs in education. My mother, in fact, was the superintendent of my entire school district at one point, a school district that was segregated, by the way, when she attended it. So that's a whole nother story. But I didn't want for much. And certainly my parents were ahead of the curve in terms of education, et cetera. But they were still Black. So as a result, their options, when you start looking at vocations, were completely limited. I mean, my mother told me explicitly, growing up, Black people, their options were you could be a preacher, a teacher, or a nurse if you were lucky. Those were pretty much the options, and the vast majority went into education or became a preacher or something related to that. She didn't have lawyer friends. She didn't have doctor friends. She didn't know anything about business, nothing. So obviously she was wicked smart. I mean, she skipped 2 years and graduated top of her class. And like I said, eventually became a superintendent of the school district, became a full professor at the University of South Carolina. My father, PhD as well, wicked smart. But they just didn't have those opportunities, didn't have that exposure. So guess what? As I was graduating from college, and we all need our family, we need our parents for counsel, for feedback, for support. I just was limited in terms of that. So when I talked about maybe going to law school, you know, in some ways they kind of looked at me like I had four heads. Like they couldn't provide any sort of support. My husband had a very similar experience. And in fact, I did a whole session with my husband. If you're interested, it's out on YouTube. He ended up becoming a physician, and he's been a physician for over 20 years, but he had like no support. He was one of the first people in his family. I guess at the time, I think he was the first person. No, his dad had gone to college later, but he was one of the first people in his family to ever attend college. So guess what? He made over 1,300. I think he said he made a 1,350 or 1,350 on the SAT, which was, again, wicked smart. He said he got letters from Ivy League colleges mailed to his house begging him to apply. He said, Dana, I just threw them in the garbage. I just crumbled them up and threw them in the garbage. He's like, nobody ever talked to me about college. I didn't know how important that was. I didn't know what the process was. I've got more stories I could get into, but I'm not. But just in terms of the workplace, I think that shows up in terms of the vocation you select. You know, do you tend to become a mechanic because your dad was a mechanic and that's pretty much all you knew? Or you tended to go, I mean, nothing against being a mechanic or being in education. I have a family full of educators, wonderful. But I'm just saying, as soon as I started asking my parents questions outside of that, it was clear that not only could they not help me, they didn't even know anybody who could help me. And not having that support is major. Because then when you get in the workplace, you get into corporate situations, we all need help. We all need mentoring. We all need support. When you don't have a basis of natural support from your own community to fall back on, I think that impacts things. So let me switch from my cute glasses to my good glasses and read some of these comments. Okay, and some of them are probably going to be too long, so I apologize. Someone says, I grew up with conflicted identity, child of immigrant, but went to school away from home, raised by white parents, I believe that is. Thank you, Abigail. Says, amazing story. Yes, we are. We're now seeing a shortage of Black psychologists, and this makes me sad for people who want to go to see a Black psychologist. I don't think people who are not from marginalized communities understand how important it is when you don't see someone who looks like you. It's sad. This came up with a lot of the Nicole Hannah Jones controversy. I watched a video, an interview that she did, and she talked about how long it was, and I can't remember, I think it might have been until college, that she said she had a professor of color, a Black professor or someone that looked like her. When you don't see that, it's really hard to say, oh, I can become a physician. You know, I can become an astronaut. I can become a surgeon. I can become a lawyer. It's really hard to do that. And there's certainly a psychological limitation there, or it's a bit of a barrier. It's an advantage that you don't have. So we talk about white advantage. You know, that's just one of the natural advantages. White people don't have to worry about not having people in front of the room who look like them. They don't have to worry about going to a meeting and not seeing leaders who are white, okay? Because that is the standard. For a lot of Black people, we just tend not to see that. Interestingly enough, I wrote an article on my Forbes page probably a year ago now about the dearth of Black male doctors. And one of the quotes from a physician, Black male physician who had done a study, talked about that lack of community. And I think the quote was something like, it's hard for you to become what you don't see. And so that is huge. So thank you so much for that, Azzy. I really appreciate that. I went to school outside my home district. Friends from the neighborhood were much different from friends from school. Absolutely agreed, and no support. They don't teach us that in school. There's so much that we just don't learn in school. And honestly, you get to corporate and it's culture shock. I mean, it is really culture shock. We haven't spoken about that. What about Black people? Think about how much segregation there is today. Okay, we're not even talking about 50 years ago. Think about how segregated. I don't care where you are. Do you live in a city where neighborhoods tend to be segregated? Interestingly enough, I can guess the answer is going to be yes. But so and my husband told me this a lot. He was like, he literally told me this actually a week ago. I forgot about this. He was like, my family was Black. Everybody I knew was Black. Everybody I played with was Black. My school was Black. In this case, my teachers were Black because it was pretty much a Black school. He was like, I really didn't see white people until we went to Disney World. He was like, I went to Disney World and I told my dad, oh, look at all these white people. Are there this many white people? So it's like you live in this cocoon, and then all of a sudden, depending upon, you're thrust into a whole different reality, whether that's work, whether that's a predominantly white institution for college. So that culture shock can be huge. And that's why code switching tends to happen. That's why oftentimes when you go to work conferences or you go to retreats, you'll see the Black people kind of huddling together. And again, not speaking for all Black people are varied and we have different experiences, but oftentimes there is that element of culture shock and you want that feeling of familiarity. And so we seek it out. So, all right, so let's go to, thank you so much for that. I'm so sorry. I don't know how many people we have on, but it looks like a lot of people. So let me just keep moving, but thank you for sharing. Keep sharing in the comments. You're talking to one another, keep tagging each other. That's awesome. So let me go to John's question. This is a juicy one. And I kind of want to pair John's question with Wendy Conrad. Wendy asked, what are some first steps that non-BIPOC leadership can take to foster anti-racism in the workplace? And how can they make it part of their business plan or model for ongoing progress? And then John asked, love this question, of course, what can a white man like me do to work towards a more inclusive workplace? So let me start with the second one, and then I'll go to the former one. Well, I'll first say, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, so go ahead and put those into the comments, because you're not just going to learn from me, you're going to learn from each other. The first one to John, it's just the fact that you're asking the question, obviously, is so huge. If every white person in this country, and really ultimately every person, but if every white person in particular had that mindset and was asking that, we kind of wouldn't have a problem. I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's just so huge, just having that mindset and having that desire. So I just want to just start there. What I would say, honestly, and please, other people chime in, I just have one perspective and I don't profess to know it all, is just cultivate a sense of awareness. Cultivate a sense of consciousness. Because that's the key. Once you have that awareness and that consciousness, then you notice things. Then you can step in to disrupt the system. Then you can act. But if you don't have it, you're like the fish swimming around saying, well, where's the water? Where's the water? Everybody keeps talking about the water. You're oblivious. You're not helpful. And, it goes without saying, white men arguably can absolutely do the most, because historically white men are overrepresented in positions of leadership, positions of authority, positions of influence. So if we want to see real structural, systemic, lasting change, that's what we need. I mean, we need white men stepping up, saying, what can I do? How can I do it? So I just have to begin at the beginning, just having that awareness, having that consciousness, because I do think that what Advantage does is it's people talk about like the invisible backpack that people of color, people from marginalized communities have that you guys don't have. So you just don't realize that it's not there. You don't realize that baggage is not there. Thank you, Abigail. So absolutely, you got to start there. And somebody asked about microaggressions, like how do we deal with microaggressions? And that was actually my topic last time. So please check out that video if you want more on that. Half my battle, honestly, as a Black person in corporate America, is just creating awareness. It's just having to deal with the day-to-day, my perceptions of white people, white men in particular at times, stepping over me, not literally, obviously, but stepping on my comments, ignoring me, devaluing me, acting like I just said something, but because somebody else just repeated it and repackaged it, it makes more sense or is more meaningful. Just knowing that I exist, being treated like I actually exist. So when I say that element of awareness, I'm not just putting it out there. For me, that's been my biggest microaggression. People ask me that sometimes. It's just being devalued. And we all know that feeling, whether it's because of race or because of something else. But when you have that feeling like you don't matter, like your opinions aren't important, like you're the person to go get the donuts, like we're not, you're not very influential in this conversation. Like what you just said, I need to repackage it or re-say it so that it can be taken seriously. That for me has been my number one experience of microaggression. So if white men just shifted their consciousness and really started noticing, well, wait a minute, Bob, I think Dana was saying something. I'd like her to complete her thought. See, you can't disrupt, you can't insert yourself, you can't use that privilege until and unless you're aware. Awareness is everything, okay? So I really want to start there. And then the other thing is 3 things that I think everybody needs to be an effective, whether you want to use the term ally or advocate or something else. 3 things. And unfortunately, white men tend to have the least of these. Racial literacy. Okay, we can't talk apples and oranges. It's literally like, if we're talking about multiple, a chronic illness, MS, something like that, and you've read one article on MS, but I've lived with MS for 30 years, we kind of can't have the same conversation because you just don't know the facts. And it's not all experiential. Certainly talk to other people of color, but, do the work, learn. That's why we're talking about these resources. So racial literacy, number 1, racial humility. You can't go into every conversation with defensiveness. You can't assume that just because you read something that contradicts what Miss Betty taught you in 8th grade, you're going to discount it. Okay? You can't assume that just because everyone treats you like you're the best thing since sliced bread or nobody contradicts you, that you're always right. You have to have some level of racial humility. What is the point of studying if you think you know everything? And again, I don't want to, generalize. This is what I would say to everybody. But in response to that question in particular, I think these 3 ingredients are so critical. It's that racial literacy, racial humility, and those 2, once you combine those 2 together, you get the gift of racial stamina. Because there's so little racial stamina in the workplace, oftentimes when these conversations come up, people just get real nervous and real jittery, and they start rattling off their racial resume and all kind of, other things that are not helpful or even counterproductive. But once you've got that racial literacy, you pair it with that racial stamina, that racial humility, you get racial stamina. Like, you know what? Dana, I hadn't thought about that. I see where you're coming from with that. Or maybe even, that's not been my experience, but I want to learn more. Tell me more. So you can stay in the game, so you can participate in the conversation. We've all had those conversations where you can tell that person is just shut down. Like, I might as well just beat my head against the wall. If you come out the gate with just complete defensiveness because you have no racial stamina, you've lived 50 years on the planet and you've never really had more than a 10-second conversation about race, or you've never really watched a mini series about race, or you've never really thought and reflected on race, how that's impacted your life. Unfortunately, what white people tend to do too often, and certainly chime in, tell me if I'm wrong, or tell me what your thoughts are, is they think of race as somebody else. They don't think of themselves as having a race. Well, I'm just white. I don't have a race, or, I'm not racial. Somebody put in there, my best friend is Black. So I'm going to cover that in detail in my next Forbes article called Dear White People, We Don't Want to Hear Your Racial Resume. Okay, so if you're interested in that topic at all, please read that article as it comes up. So those are things that I feel, and John, I hope that that's helpful. If you combine that with the tools that we specifically talked about before, and then let me get to Wendy's comment, because she asked slightly different. What are some of the first steps that non-BIPOC leadership can take or should take to foster anti-racism in the workplace. Let me just do shameless plug. I did write 2 courses that are available now on LinkedIn Learning where I feel like I unpack this in detail. So I know I can't do it justice in the next few minutes here. So let me just mention the course, Supporting Allyship and Anti-Racism at Work. That one is specifically targeted at what can all of us do, not just BIPOC leadership, but what can all of us do to truly support and advance anti-racism at work. So please take some time to watch that. And then also how to speak up against racism at work. And ironically, that's one of the things they can do. Again, for most workplaces, non-BIPOC leadership are overrepresented in leadership, in authority. So speaking up, disrupting, asking the question. I mean, things that might seem small. You know what? We always kind of seem to use these same 2 suppliers. When's the last time we revisited our supplier list? Or what is the criteria? How much diversity do we have? How many Black suppliers do we have? And don't be afraid to get specific. Okay, that's a whole nother conversation we need to have another day. But don't be afraid. How many have we ever worked with an indigenous supplier, particularly if you live in an area that maybe would pull from that community? Asian supplier? Ask those questions. Speak up. What about our speaker panel coming up? Gosh, I've noticed there are no Black people on the speaker panel. Is that the best we can do, or why is that? Or what is our criteria that we're using? Where are we recruiting from? People say there's no talent, or the pipeline doesn't produce the diversity you want, but where are you looking? If 90% of the institutions you're recruiting from are predominantly white institutions, it's kind of, you're going to get primarily white candidates. So how many historically Black colleges and universities have we reached out to? Have we partnered with? Have we worked with? So, Karana, I apologize if I mispronounced that. She says, please don't be hesitant to be specific. Yeah, so I'm not going to share that one. So great comments here. Give equal space to everyone. That is a big one. So Wendy, let me also share with you in terms of, you asked the first things. So I'm a data person. I mean, my background was math and engineering, okay? And my first job was a metrics manager. So I'm all about process improvement. I'm a data person. And by the way, that's kind of the tack I take with the course about advancing anti-racism. But when I was a strategy consultant about a millennia ago, we used to help teams and large organizations when they were trying to go through a major business transformation. And so we use something called the as is versus to be. And it's not surprising, super simple, but it's kind of saying you got to get the data, figure out what's your as is. Where are you now? Then let's come up with some reasonable targets about what the to be looks like. And let's get really specific about describing what that to be should look like. Then once we know what the as is, we know what the to be, what's the gap? What's the delta? What do we need to do practically, specifically, not warm and fuzzy, kumbaya, we wish we had more diversity, let's try to get there, okay? That's not helping. But very practical and specific, just like I was talking about the other examples I was just talking through. So I would say, one, gather the data. You may want to conduct a diversity audit, or even more specifically, an anti-racism audit. And I've got a whole spiel about why I feel it's problematic to conflate those 2 concepts, because they're not the same. They're both important, but I feel they're not the same. Again, if you want more on that, I have a whole article about that on Forbes, about if you're expecting to leave this to diversity and inclusion leaders, think again. Again, no shade to D&I leaders. They play a really, really important role. But what too many organizations do is they kind of hide under that too broad D&I umbrella, which they felt so much political pressure to basically include everybody and everything, to the point where there really is no focus on anti-racism. And so we end up kind of spinning our wheels and not really addressing some of the specific issues that need to be addressed. And again, a lot of those areas are important, not diminishing that at all. But too often what happens is because we're uncomfortable with the race conversation, we hide from it. So it's like a game of double dutch, okay? And it's like, I don't want the rope to hit me, so I'm going to stay over here because I'm comfortable talking about that. I'm comfortable talking about introvert, extrovert. So I'll just kind of talk about that. I'll leave this alone over here. I don't want to talk about that. So I would say conduct that audit so that you know where you are. And by the way, there are lots of D&I leaders and organizations out there who can help you create that or conduct that audit. Then create some really specific measurable goals, okay? Just as you would. And you know, this is what I would say if I had to put it into a nutshell, treat racism and discrimination the same way you would any other business problem. And it's amazing. It's like once we start treating it like we would any other problem, let's say our problem was that millennials weren't using our product or that we were having horrible traction outside the US. Great. Let's understand the problem. Let's analyze the problem. Let's figure out what are those specific steps we need to do to bridge that gap. So I would say come up with those very specific, tangible objectives, make them measurable, and make them part of the fundamental strategic plan for the organization. Don't have it over here to the side. See, that's one of the problems is we think of anti-racism as, okay, that's over here, that's in the diversity bucket. So really, if we're not talking about diversity, we're not thinking about that. No, you want to infuse it throughout the organization. So we should be thinking about equity as we're talking about finance, as we're looking at marketing, as we're looking at supplier management, as we're looking at IT and development. Think about how can we infuse equity in all of those areas of our business. And then let's come up with specific, tangible objectives that can help us move from the as is to the to be. And while we're at it, let's tie some of this to compensation, okay? And I'm not saying that to be provocative, but that's the way organizations tend to run. And what's important is what gets measured. And if you really want to impact behavior, tie it to compensation. The same way you would tie any other strategic imperative, a strategic initiative or priority to compensation. So I hope that that was helpful for you. And so thank you. You guys are all just sending in great comments, and that's so helpful. So with that, I know we've only got, how much more time? We've got less than 10 minutes. So I just want to go through a few other questions, and my apologies in advance if I didn't get a chance to get to your question. I know that a lot of these, I did chime in previously, so hopefully you can see that as well. So Sasha Bennett asked, can you give me your definition of racism? I just love answering that question. So many definitions out there. The two that I tend to use, I like them because they're simple. One, prejudice plus power. We can all be prejudiced, right? And prejudice is a horrible thing. But where it really evolves into racism is when that person who's prejudiced against you also has power, okay? Think about it if you're a college student in that college classroom. You know, I don't know about you, but some of my classes were pretty big. We might have 100 people in the class. Let's say somebody in there didn't like me, okay? Maybe they came from a background where they didn't socialize with Black people, whatever. They didn't like me because of my color. Maybe they thought I wasn't that smart. I might know that, maybe it doesn't make me feel great, but what if the professor now doesn't like me or thinks that I'm intellectually inferior or thinks I'm just not as smart, I'm not as bright, I'm not, I shouldn't be a candidate for a Rhodes Scholarship or for a Fulbright Scholarship? Do you see the difference? This, you know, knucklehead over here who doesn't like me or has prejudiced thoughts, yeah, he might have them, but, you know, who cares? We all have some level of bias, different prejudices. But if the teacher the professor who is grading me, or let's bring it to the workplace, if it's your boss or your boss's boss who has a significant amount of influence, then it can switch over into racism. And by the way, one of the things I talk about, because that's an example of individualized racism, I definitely want to give you guys the full context. When I talk about racism in the workplace, in my course that's on LinkedIn Learning, I talked about it showing up 3 different ways. And you can categorize, I've seen racism categorized lots of different ways, but I choose these 3 different ways. There's the individual level, which we all, I think, understand, that person who holds those racist views and as a result is negatively impacting you as a result of those racist views. There's internalized racism, where maybe if I've grown up thinking I'm less than, I don't try for that promotion, or I just kind of stay in this area because it's comfortable. And, you know, my mom was in HR and HR feels familiar to me, but I don't think of myself as an IT person, or I don't think of myself as a finance person. I don't think of myself as being the next CFO, or maybe in 20 years being a CFO. Or as I develop my decks and I'm pulling my images, you know, all the images of leaders are all white because that's what's out there. And I've just kind of internalized that. And then the third level, which I would argue is the most significant, is that structural or systemic racism. It's where we may not be overtly racist. We all want equity, but we don't realize that there's a system that's at work behind the scenes. And if we don't go in to disrupt that system, maybe there are policies in place. Maybe, like I said, there's vendor selection criteria that really does advantage some groups and disadvantage other groups, but nobody's revisited that in 20 years, or no one's revisited the schools that we recruit from, the partnerships that we have. So we just kind of keep going on. You know, we keep going on. You know, we keep bringing in our diversity speaker every other month and patting ourselves on the back and sharing our racial resume and, you know, putting our hashtag Black Lives Matter, and we think we're doing it, okay? But behind the scenes, there is structural inequity, pay inequity. Jacqueline just made a comment about pay. Has anybody done an audit or looked at the fact that, you know, Black women are not making what white men are making, or making what white women are making? So have we brought someone in to look at pay equity and then take steps to bring about more pay equity? So those things, the structural racism, that's where, in my view, it's most significant. So those 3 different levels of racism. And I said I was going to have a second definition, right? So my second definition, I think it's David. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Oh, in the video, I'm sorry. I so apologize. I mentioned his name, but I wanted to try to attribute it to someone because it's not my definition. But a system of advantage based on race. Okay. And interestingly enough, the first time I heard that definition, I thought, well, shouldn't it be a system of disadvantage? But then I started learning and realizing that that's what we do. When we think about racism, we kind of think of it through the lens of it's Black people's problem, or indigenous people's problem, or brown people, or Asians. But really, it's the advantage that white people have historically had that other communities, because of the history of oppression, typically have not had. So I love that definition, a system of advantage based on race. And remember, the first word is a system. It's not just because somebody in their basement eating Cheetos hates Black people, okay? He can sit in his basement and hate Black people. You know, that's on him. That's between him and his conscience and his maker. That's not necessarily hurting me. But it's the system of advantage based on race. So hopefully that was helpful to you guys. And I know that I'm almost out of time. My apologies again. I know we didn't have a chance to get to all of the questions, but I really want to thank you guys. I feel like we're building such a huge community. There was one question about microaggressions. I want to just let you guys know the last session like this that I did was specifically on microaggressions. And because we had so much content, we said we're going to come back to it again. So look up that previous video, and it might be easier to find it on YouTube. Honestly, they're all there on YouTube, so you can scroll through and find that topic. But then the next session I'm going to do, I'm taking off. We do this first and third Tuesdays at noon. So mark your calendar. First and third Tuesdays at noon. If you can, please join us. The next one, the first week of August, I'm going to be on vacation. So I'm taking that one off. But I'm coming back August 17th, and we're tackling that topic of microaggressions again. It was such a good conversation. We had so much. I'm coming back with my friend from college, Karen Cisse, who's also an actress. You can see her on Stranger Things and Walking Dead and lots of great stuff. But we're going to come back and talk about microaggression. So if you had some questions about that, you really, really want to tune in on August 17th. So again, I just want to thank you guys. This has been such an amazing community. Thank you for sharing your time. I'm so grateful. And please continue to actively comment. I'm learning, or I hope we're all learning from each other. So thank you guys. I will see you August 17th. Mark your calendars.